In October of 2009, in a conference room that produced no famous photograph, General Motors signed a definitive agreement to sell the entire Hummer brand. The buyer was not another American manufacturer, not a European luxury house, not any name a viewer would recognize. It was Sichuan Tengzhong Heavy Industrial Machinery, a Chinese company barely 4 years old, with roughly 4,800 employees and no experience building automobiles, that had never put a single car on a single road. The most aggressively American object ever sold, a 2.5-ton statement of excess descended from a military truck, was about to belong to an obscure machinery maker on the other side of the world. It was the vehicle that had carried celebrities down Sunset Boulevard and soldiers across desert highways, the machine that turned a war truck into a status symbol, and now it was for sale to a firm most of its own countrymen could not have found on a map. The agreed price was about $150 million. The story America remembers does not include that document. In the version everyone knows, the Hummer died at the gas pump. It drank fuel at 10 miles to the gallon, gas climbed past $4 a gallon, the economy collapsed in 2008, and a country that had once celebrated the thing finally lost patience with it. The 10-mile-per-gallon dinosaur was slain by $4 fuel and a guilty national conscience. It is a clean story, and it is the wrong one. Because General Motors had a buyer, it had a contract in hand and a signature on the page, a deal that would have carried the marque forward under new ownership even after its home market turned away. And the story of how the Hummer actually died is also the story of a company almost no one remembers, a government on the far side of the Pacific, and a single veto delivered for the very same reason America had already walked away from the brand. The Hummer's sales died in the United States. The Hummer itself did not die there. It died months later, thousands of miles from any American showroom, in the quiet arithmetic of a regulatory review that most Americans never heard about and would never think to blame. The Hummer did not die at an American gas pump. It died in a Chinese regulator's office. Chapter 1. The Most American Machine. Before it was a status symbol, it was a weapon. The vehicle that would end its life waiting on the ruling of a Chinese ministry began as the high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, the Humvee, a wide, flat, unlovely truck built by A.M. General to carry American soldiers and their equipment across ground that destroyed ordinary machines. It had no luxury in it and no pretense of any. It was engineered to survive the desert, the mountain, and the mine-strewn road, and in the Gulf War of 1991, it did exactly that, on television, in front of a nation that watched its columns roll across the sand and decided that it wanted one. The nation got its wish. In 1992, A.M. General took that war truck and built a version for civilians. The civilian Hummer came off the same assembly line as the vehicles bound for the Army, the same frame and the same welds, altered only enough to make it legal and habitable for a private owner. Nothing about it was softened or disguised, and that was the point. The appeal of the machine was precisely that it was a military vehicle a private citizen could buy and drive to the grocery store, an act of consumption that announced itself for a block in every direction. The civilian Hummer existed at all in part because of one man's appetite for it. The actor Arnold Schwarzenegger had seen the military trucks on a road and wanted one of his own, and he is widely credited with pressing A.M. General to build a road-legal version, taking delivery of one of the first. It was a fitting origin for the brand. The Hummer was, from its first civilian mile, an object bought to be seen. The marketing never pretended otherwise. In time, the brand would sell itself under a single line like nothing else, and it meant the words as plainly as they could be meant. For its first years, the Hummer belonged to A.M. General, not to General Motors. GM did not invent the Hummer and did not build it. What GM did was recognize what it was looking at. In 1999, the company took over the marketing of the civilian truck, and in December 1999, A.M. General sold the Hummer brand name to General Motors outright, while continuing to build the vehicles itself in Indiana. GM had bought a reputation and a silhouette. It set about turning them into a product line. The original truck, the one descended most directly from the Army vehicle, was rebadged the H1. It was enormous, thirsty, and impractical, and it was never meant to sell in real numbers. It was the halo, the proof of blood, the vehicle that let all the others claim descent from a war machine. Beneath it, GM built the brand it actually wanted. In 2002, the company launched the H2, smaller and cheaper than the H1, and built on General Motors' own truck underpinnings, a vehicle that looked like the machine that had crossed the desert but cost and drove like something a suburban family could finance over 5 years. In the middle of the decade came the H3, smaller still and cheaper still, the Hummer scaled down until it could fit in an ordinary driveway beside an ordinary sedan. GM had taken the excess and industrialized it. For a few years, the strategy worked as few brand experiments ever have. The Hummer became one of the defining objects of its decade, the vehicle of a country that was confident, at war but victorious in its own telling, and paying so little at the pump that a truck returning 10 miles to the gallon read as an eccentricity rather than an indictment. It appeared in music videos and on magazine covers. Actors and athletes bought them in pairs, in colors that no soldier had ever been issued, and parked them outside restaurants where the point was not to go anywhere but to be seen having arrived. The machine built to be invisible in a combat zone had become, in civilian hands, the least invisible object on the American road. The numbers followed the noise. Sales climbed year over year as GM widened the range and lowered the entry price, until the badge that had begun as a single impractical war truck sat on 3 different vehicles in 3 different driveways at 3 different prices. In 2006, the brand reached its high water mark. That year, General Motors sold 71,524 Hummers across all of its models, the most the marque would ever sell in a single year, the peak of a decade-long climb from a novelty for the wealthy to a fixture of the American suburb. It was as far as the Hummer would ever rise. The country that bought 71,524 of them in 2006 was a country that did not yet know what was coming. The gas was cheap, the credit was easy, and the future was expected to look like the present, only larger and heavier and louder. The Hummer was the perfect vehicle for that expectation, a bet on an America that would always have room and fuel and appetite to spare. Within 2 years, all 3 of those things would be gone, and the machine built to look invincible would become the most conspicuous casualty of their disappearance. Chapter 2. The Myth of the Gas Pump. The 3 things the Hummer had counted on did not vanish slowly. They went together, and they went fast. The cheap gasoline that had let a 10-mile-per-gallon truck read as an eccentricity rather than an indictment began to climb in 2007, and through the first half of 2008, the climb became something the country had not seen before. The national average price of gasoline rose toward and then past $4 a gallon, a figure that had once seemed theoretical and now printed itself on every filling station sign in America. A vehicle that drank fuel the way the Hummer did could not hide from a number that large, displayed that publicly, that often. Then the credit went too. In the fall of 2008, the financial system seized, the housing market that had underwritten so much easy spending gave way, and the recession that followed carried off the confidence that had ever put an army truck in a suburban driveway as a statement. The 2 forces arrived close enough together to feel like a single verdict. The country that had bought 71,524 Hummers in 2006 looked at the machine 2 years later and saw something it no longer wished to be seen in. More than a product had turned. A symbol had. For most of a decade, the Hummer had been the face of American confidence, and now that same confidence was being blamed for the wreckage. The excess that had once looked like success looked, after the crash, like the cause of it, and the largest, loudest, thirstiest expression of that excess sat in plain view on every road. The Hummer had been the perfect vehicle for the decade that was ending. It became the perfect symbol of everything that decade now stood accused of. The sales collapse was immediate and steep. In 2007, as fuel prices rose, Hummer sales fell about 22%. In 2008, as the recession deepened, they fell about 50% more, a halving laid on top of the previous year's decline. By 2009, the brand that had moved more than 70,000 vehicles at its peak sold roughly 9,000, a small fraction of what it had commanded 3 years before. The line did not bend, it broke. What made the fall so total was that it was never only financial. The Hummer had always sold on what it announced about its owner, and the thing it announced had reversed. In the confident years, the truck had said that its driver had arrived, that fuel and space and appetite were to be spent rather than counted. To a country watching gasoline cross $4 and neighbors lose their homes, the same truck said something nearer the opposite. It said its owner had not been paying attention. The word the culture reached for was old and unforgiving, gas guzzler, an entire indictment carried in a single word, and it fastened onto the Hummer and would not come off. The machine that had been photographed outside restaurants was now the object a careful person did not wish to be caught driving. Even the men who had championed it turned. Schwarzenegger, the actor who had pressed for the first civilian Hummer and taken delivery of one of the earliest, was by the late 2000s the governor of California and a public advocate for cleaner air, and he had his own Hummers converted to run on alternative fuel. The brand's most famous early customer had become, within a single decade, a living contradiction of the values that now condemned it. By the time General Motors began to weigh what to do with the brand, the verdict was already written, and it was simple. The Hummer had been a creature of cheap gas and easy credit, and cheap gas and easy credit were gone. Fuel economy had killed it. The 10-mile-per-gallon relic had finally met gasoline at $4 a gallon, and a guilty national conscience had finished the work. It was a clean story, it fit everything the public could see, and in the part that mattered most, it was wrong. A collapse in sales is not the death of a brand. The two are easily confused, and they are not the same thing. Sales measure how many people will buy a product in 1 year at one price in one economy, and all three of those conditions had turned against the Hummer at once. A brand is something more durable. A name, a reputation, a body of designs and trademarks and dealer agreements, an asset that can be owned, valued, and sold. Sales can fall to almost nothing while the brand itself remains intact, waiting for a different owner, a different market, or a different decade. And a brand with a buyer does not die. A marque abandoned by its home market can survive under new ownership in another country, sold to customers its original makers had never served. Falling American sales made the Hummer worth a great deal less than it had once been. They did not, by themselves, end it. They set a price on it. The fuel prices, then, did precisely what the myth credits them with, and nothing more. They gutted the sales. They turned a status symbol into an embarrassment and a profit line into a liability, and they forced General Motors to choose whether to keep the brand or let it go. That was real damage, and it was permanent. But it was damage to a business, not a death certificate for a marque. The thing that would actually kill the Hummer had not yet happened, and when it came, it would come from a direction no one watching the American gas pumps was facing. For the story of the Hummer's death is not, in the end, the story of what happened on this side of the ocean. It is the story of a buyer almost no one would remember, and a decision reached in a government office 5,000 miles from Detroit. The gas pump set the price. It did not write the ending. Chapter 3. The buyer nobody remembers. The company that had made the Hummer a brand did not outlast the decade that had made it rich. On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for bankruptcy, and the giant that had bought the Hummer name 10 years earlier walked into a federal bankruptcy court and began to come apart. The glass towers of its Detroit headquarters still carried the company's name, but the corporation inside them was being taken to pieces and rebuilt. Everything General Motors owned was suddenly a question. Everything it did not need was for sale. Hummer had already been on the block for a year. General Motors first put the brand up for sale in 2008. In the same months, the fuel prices were emptying its showrooms, and the hope at the time had been large. The company wanted as much as $500 million for the marque, the name, and the tooling that built it. That figure belonged to a market that no longer existed. By the summer of 2009, the Hummer was no longer a prize being auctioned to the highest bidder. It was one line on a long list of things a bankrupt company needed to shed, ranked somewhere below the brands General Motors had chosen to save, and somewhere above the ones it would simply close. Then came the buyer, and the buyer made no sense. The day after the bankruptcy filing, General Motors announced a tentative agreement to sell the Hummer line to a company almost no one in America had heard of. Its name was Sichuan Tengzhong Heavy Industrial Machinery. It was a Chinese firm based in the southwestern province of Sichuan, and it had been in existence for only about 4 years. It employed roughly 4,800 people. It built heavy industrial machinery, the equipment of construction and road building, and it had never built an automobile of any kind. The distance between what the Hummer was and who was buying it was almost too wide to hold in a single thought. On one side stood a vehicle that existed to announce American appetite, built in the American heartland on the same line as the war trucks. On the other stood a young machinery maker in Sichuan, unknown outside its own industry, that had never turned out a passenger car. Nothing in the Hummer's history had prepared it for this. The brand that had been the face of one country's confidence was about to become the property of another. The negotiations held. In October 2009, the tentative understanding became a definitive agreement. The contract's own term for a deal that was no longer conditional in principle, but reduced to signed and binding language. The price had fallen as far as the market around it, where General Motors had once hoped for $500 million. The Tengzhong offer was estimated at about $150 million, less than a third of the earlier ambition. The most famous shape in the recent history of the automobile had been marked down to the price of its own decline. Why the Chinese company wanted the Hummer at all was a question that puzzled observers on both sides of the ocean. The answer, as far as it could be read, lay in the one thing the brand had not lost. Even in collapse, the Hummer name carried a recognition that few brands anywhere could match, and to a company with global ambitions and no automotive past, buying it whole was a way to acquire in a single transaction what would otherwise take decades to build: a design, a factory relationship, a dealer network, above all, a name the entire world already knew. Tengzhong did not need the American market to love the Hummer. It needed the Hummer to exist, and at a price that had collapsed to a fraction of its former worth, the company could own a legend outright. For General Motors, the logic was simpler and colder. A sale at almost any price was better than a shutdown. Selling the brand returned some cash, preserved the jobs at the plants that built the trucks, and let the corporation retire one more name without the full expense and the blame of killing it in the open. And so, by the autumn of 2009, the story the public believed had already come apart, though almost no one noticed. The Hummer was not dead. It had a buyer, a signed contract, and a plan for a life after America, built and sold under new ownership by a company that answered to a different market and a different set of rules. The fuel prices had set the price. This sale would decide whether there was an ending at all, but a signed contract between an American automaker and a Chinese machinery company was not, by itself, enough to move the Hummer from one owner to the other. A sale of that size, across that border, was not a matter the two companies could settle between themselves. It required the consent of a party that had signed nothing, promised nothing, and whose interest in the Hummer had nothing to do with its price. The deal that now held the brand's life still had to pass through a government office in Beijing. The fate of the Hummer now rested with the government of China. Chapter 4. The Veto. A sale of that size did not belong to the two companies that had signed it. The purchase of a foreign automotive brand by a Chinese firm required the approval of the state, and the state, in this case, meant the National Development and Reform Commission, the planning body in Beijing that decided which industries China would build and which it would let wither. General Motors and Sichuan Tengzhong had reached their terms. Whether those terms would ever take effect was not theirs to determine. It rested with a commission of officials who had never wanted the Hummer and owed its rescue nothing. If the quiet deaths of America's great marques are the kind of history worth keeping, subscribing keeps this channel digging them up. What happened next in Beijing decided the Hummer's ending outright. For months, the deal simply waited. The definitive agreement had been signed in October 2009, and through the winter that followed, it sat in a condition of suspended animation, neither approved nor formally refused, a completed contract that could not become a transfer of ownership. The two companies had done everything asked of them. The one signature the sale still required belonged to a government in no hurry to provide it, and with each passing week, the silence out of Beijing grew harder to read as anything other than a refusal. The National Development and Reform Commission was not persuaded. Its objections as they reached the press over that winter fell into two parts. The first was practical. Tengzhong was barely 4 years old, employed roughly 4,800 people, and had never built a passenger car in its existence, and the commission doubted that a machinery maker of that size and that inexperience had the capacity to take on an entire foreign automobile brand and keep it alive. The second objection was larger, and it was the one that mattered. An expensive, gas-guzzling sport utility vehicle, a truck that consumed fuel at the rate the rest of the industry was racing to abandon, did not belong in the future Beijing had decided to build. China's stated policy was the promotion of energy-efficient vehicles, and the Hummer was the single most efficient argument against everything that phrase contained. Here the story arrives at the irony it had been moving toward from the start. The reason China's regulators refused the Hummer was, almost word for word, the reason America had already turned its back on it. In the United States, the rejection had come from the market, from $4 gasoline, and a public that no longer wished to be seen behind the wheel of so much appetite. In China, it came from the state, from a planning commission drafting the transport policy of the coming decade. But the verdict was identical. The Hummer was too thirsty and too dirty for the world that was arriving. Two governments and two economies with almost nothing in common had looked at the same machine and reached the same conclusion, on opposite sides of the planet, within months of each other. What the record does not settle is the matter of intent, and it is here that the ledger stays open. It never records whether General Motors had truly meant to save the Hummer, or whether a sale to a buyer that could not clear its own government was only a way to retire the brand at arm's length, killed by a foreign veto rather than by Detroit's own hand. The largest question it leaves open is the one it can never answer. Was the commission in Beijing right to refuse the Hummer, to end an American icon in the name of a cleaner future, or was that future merely the cover for a judgment already made? The documents record what was decided. They do not record what was meant. The decision, when it came, was delivered without ceremony. On February 24th to 25th, 2010, General Motors announced that the agreement with Sichuan Tengzhong had failed, that the sale could not win the approval it required, and that the company would therefore wind the Hummer brand down. The statement fell to a General Motors vice president named John Smith. "We are disappointed that the deal with Tengzhong could not be completed," he said, and the company would work closely with Hummer employees, dealers, and suppliers to wind down the business in an orderly and responsible manner. It was the language of a funeral conducted by administrators, measured, courteous, and final. There would be no auction of last resort, no second buyer waiting in the wings. The brand that had outlived the collapse of its own market because it still held a contract had now lost the contract too. And so, the most aggressively American object ever put on a public road was retired, not by the country that built it and not by the pump that had emptied its showrooms, but by a commission of Chinese officials who found it incompatible with the future they intended to build. The gas prices had taken the sales, the recession had taken the buyers. But the thing that took the brand itself, that closed the last door and turned the Hummer from a company still for sale into a name being quietly wound down, was a signature that never came from an office on the far side of the world. A foreign government, not a fuel gauge, had ended it. Chapter 5. The Electric Ghost. The ending itself was quiet, as such endings usually are. A brand does not die the way a company does, in a single filing on a single morning. It dies slowly, across a winter and a spring, in the closing of order books, the settling of dealer agreements, and the finishing of the last vehicles already promised. Through 2010, the remaining Hummers came off the line, the marketing stopped, the showroom placards came down, and the name that General Motors had bought 11 years earlier was retired to the archive of things that used to be built. There was no last-minute reprieve, no rival bidder arriving late with a better offer. The sale to Sichuan Tengzhong had been the only door open, and Beijing had closed it. With the brand finally at rest, the whole account can at last be settled, because the confusion at the center of the Hummer's legend was never a matter of facts in dispute. Every number in the story is real, and none of them is hidden. The confusion was one of sequence, of mistaking two separate deaths for a single one. The sales of the Hummer died in America, at the American gas pump. Over the 3 years the myth remembers so well, they fell about 22% in 2007, about 50% in 2008, and down to roughly 9,000 units by 2009, cut to a fraction of the 71,524 the brand had sold at its 2006 peak. That death was real, it was public, and it was administered by $4 gasoline in a country that had stopped wanting to be seen behind the wheel of so much appetite. But the sales are not the marquee. The marque, the name itself, and the legal right to build and sell under it, did not die in any American showroom. It survived the collapse of its own market for one reason, because a distressed General Motors had found a buyer for it, a signed and definitive agreement that would have carried the Hummer into a second life under new ownership. And that name died only when the agreement did, in early 2010, not in Detroit and not at a fuel pump, but in the offices of a planning commission in Beijing that refused to let the sale proceed. The public remembers the two events as one because they arrived so close together and pointed the same way. They were not one event. One death was economic and happened in America. The other was administrative and happened in China. The gas prices emptied the showrooms. A foreign regulator closed the brand. For 10 years afterward, the name simply sat, unused, the property of a corporation that had no plans for it, a discontinued badge and a portfolio of discontinued badges. And then, in the stretch from 2020 to 2022, General Motors did the one thing the entire history of the Hummer would have seemed to forbid. It brought the name back. It did not bring back the machine. What returned wore the old name and almost nothing else of the old idea, The revived Hummer arrived as an electric truck sold under the GMC name, a battery-powered vehicle with no engine to feed and no tailpipe to answer for. The 10-mile-per-gallon symbol of American excess reborn as a thing that burned no gasoline at all. The brand whose entire meaning had been consumption, the rolling argument for having more and apologizing for none of it, came back as a machine designed around the opposite premise. And here the record delivers its final and most complete irony, the one the whole story had been moving toward. The reason the Hummer had been refused, on both sides of the planet, was that it was too thirsty and too dirty for the future that was arriving. Beijing's stated policy, the policy in whose name the Commission had killed the sale, had been the promotion of energy-efficient vehicles, and the Hummer had been the single most efficient argument against everything that phrase contained. When General Motors finally revived the brand, it revived it as precisely the kind of vehicle that phrase described. The electric Hummer was, in the plainest terms, an energy-efficient vehicle, the exact thing China's regulators had demanded, and the exact thing the American market had said it wanted instead. The demand that had refused the Hummer and the specification that resurrected it were not two forces. They were the same force arriving a decade apart, first as a rejection and then as a blueprint. The vehicle that had been killed for what it burned returned only after it stopped burning anything. The government veto that ended the marque in 2010 and the engineering brief that restored it around 2021 were at bottom the same instruction, the same insistence on a cleaner and more efficient future, honored the second time in a way it had been resisted the first. What Beijing had refused to approve, Detroit eventually chose to build, and it called the result a Hummer. That is the shape the legend never keeps. The Hummer is remembered as the machine that gas prices killed, the dinosaur finally slain by $4 fuel and a guilty national conscience, and that memory is not so much wrong as incomplete, a true account of the sales mistaken for the cause of the death. The gas prices took the customers, the recession took the buyers. A commission in Beijing, ruling that an American gas guzzler had no place in the transport policy of the coming decade, took the brand. And a decade later, that same demand for a cleaner future, the one both governments and both markets had been reaching for all along, is what handed the name back. The Hummer was not killed by the price of gas. It was killed by a government that wanted the same future America did, and it returned only once it agreed to build that future,